All right, let's dive in. You've sent over a really interesting batch of documents touching on all sorts of things, but with one common thread, the investigation into the JFK assassination. It's almost like piecing together a puzzle, seeing how these seemingly separate elements could connect to the bigger picture.
It's incredible the variety in these records. You really get a sense of the scope of things back then, the intelligence world and the investigations that followed an event like President Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got several CIA documents to start with. The first few, 104.14.063, 101.79.pdf, 104.14066.pdf, 104.1063, 104.66.pdf, 104.1063, 104.63, 104.34.pdf all look like CIA stuff.
Right.
The first one, 104.1063, 101.79.pdf, is from March 6, 1973. It talks about Eldridge Cleaver and some other Black Panthers getting arrested in Algeria. They had weapons, and the documents marked as secret. On the surface, a report on the Black Panthers from 1973 might seem like it's miles away from what happened in 1963. But do you think this gives us any insights, even indirectly, into the atmosphere surrounding the JFK assassination?
That's a great question. Even though it's 10 years after the assassination, it gives us a glimpse into how the CIA was keeping an eye on politically active groups even after the 60s, a period of huge upheaval. The Black Panthers were a major force during that time. This document shows that the CIA was still interested in monitoring domestic unrest and the international ties these groups might have. This whole context of domestic surveillance, concerns about threats, that was definitely a big part of the time leading up to and after Kennedy's death.
That's really insightful. It really shows us what the agency was focused on operationally. Then we have 104.1063, 102.06.pdf. It's a routing sheet from March 1st, 1972, and it sums up some contact reports with a person codenamed MHCHAOS. They talk about U.S.-China relations, Soviet studies, even a potential trip to Europe. MHCHAOS also asked for something concealable, some kind of device. So what does this seemingly unconnected report tell us?
Well, MHCHAOS, that's a cryptonym. The agency used code names like that to protect people's identities. This document, though it's from after the assassination, gives us a peek into the many different intelligence activities the CIA was carrying out during the Cold War. Their interests were all over the place: academic stuff, international travel, even tech requests. That suggests this agent or informant had a lot of connections.
Wow.
It really highlights how widespread intelligence gathering was during that time. Now, thinking about the JFK assassination, it reminds us that the global stage was incredibly complex back then, with lots of competing interests and intelligence operations happening all over. Any of these could have crossed paths with the events in Dallas, even if indirectly.
So we're seeing a very active, multifaceted intelligence machine at work. Now we have 104.1063, 102.66.pdf from July 7, 1972. It's a secret message about something called MHCHAOS, and it mentions that some union representatives, James Hoffa, Harold Gibbons, and William Taub, were invited to visit Vientiane in Paris. The document really stresses the need for any MHCHAOS info they can get. Now, Hoffa's name popping up here is really interesting considering his background. How do you think this could connect, even just speculatively, to the JFK assassination?
You're right. The mention of James Hoffa definitely raises some questions. Operation MHCHAOS, as we'll see later, was a controversial CIA program that involved watching anti-war and civil rights activists within the U.S. Now, Hoffa was a powerful labor leader, and there were rumors about his ties to organized crime and his dislike for Robert Kennedy. So he becomes a figure of potential interest, even if it's circumstantial. While this document from '72 doesn't directly tie him to the assassination in '63, the fact that he was being watched under MHCHAOS suggests the agency thought he could be disruptive, influential enough to keep tabs on, and him planning trips to sensitive places makes it even more interesting.
It adds another layer to the whole story. Knowing that Hoffa, who had some well-known conflicts with the Kennedys, was under this kind of scrutiny is pretty significant. Continuing with MHCHAOS, we have 104.10063, 104.30.pdf and 104.10063, 104.34.pdf, both from 1977. They talk about the classification of something called EX3600, which they say is the same thing as MHCHAOS.
Right.
These memos really emphasize how sensitive the sources and methods were, especially FBI reports on peace movement groups. They use that to justify keeping things classified. What do you think these later documents tell us about the JFK assassination?
These are really important for understanding why there's still so much secrecies surrounding operations like MHCHAOS. The fact that they were still debating the classification level years after the program ran shows how sensitive the information they gathered was and how sensitive the methods they used were. When we think about the JFK assassination, It reinforces the idea that back then the U.S. government was deeply involved in domestic surveillance, often using sources and methods that were heavily protected. This atmosphere of secrecy, the monitoring of all these groups, it could have easily obscured or complicated things when people were trying to understand what happened around the assassination, especially if any individuals or groups involved with or tracked by MHCHAOS had even a remote connection to the events.
So the secrecy itself becomes a part of the puzzle. Now let's move on to the documents labeled 104-10064. The first one, 104-10064-1006.pdf, is a dispatch from 1971 sending photocopies of Timothy Leary's documents. They refer to it as Rybat MHCHAOS. Pretty interesting to see Timothy Leary, a big figure in the counterculture movement, tied to MHCHAOS. What do you make of that connection?
The mention of Rybat MHCHAOS confirms that even someone like Timothy Leary, who was associated with the counterculture, was part of this domestic surveillance program. Leary's views challenging the establishment and his influence on young people during the Vietnam War likely made him someone intelligence agencies wanted to keep an eye on, especially since they were worried about internal stability. Now, while Leary himself has no clear direct link to the JFK assassination, his presence in the MHCHAOS files shows just how wide-reaching these surveillance efforts were. The agency was interested in monitoring a whole spectrum of individuals and movements they considered potentially disruptive during a time of massive social change.
It really emphasizes how far-reaching the surveillance was. The next one, 104-120-3641-1S11.pdf, is from 1967, and it's all about the activities of something called Beheiren, which was the Japan Peace for Vietnam Committee. The document digs into their anti-Vietnam War efforts, their connections with U.S. Navy deserters, and suspected communist ties. It even names supporters and breaks down what they were doing. This seems pretty far removed geographically and thematically. How do you think this relates back to the JFK assassination?
What's really fascinating here is how global the reach of U.S. intelligence was during the Cold War. This document shows that the CIA wasn't just watching anti-war movements at home, they were also monitoring them internationally, including any ties to Americans and any signs of communist influence. Now, Beheiren's focus was on the Vietnam War, which really escalated after Kennedy's death, but this report shows us how worried the agency was about dissent and international networks during a time when global tensions were already high. The methods they used, identifying supporters, tracking activities, that was standard intelligence practice back then. It's possible that some people involved in these international movements through completely different channels might have had some connection, even if it was very distant, to the political scene around the assassination. But this specific document doesn't really suggest that directly.
It shows how interconnected global politics and intelligence gathering were during the Cold War. Let's move on to the documents labeled 104-10065. 104-10065-1011.pdf is from 1972, and it's an INBEEB watch list with names and details about people. It mentions that this list could affect the president's safety during a trip to Europe, and they ask for travel information. This is after the assassination, but what does it tell us about the bigger picture?
This document, even though it's from after the assassination, is important because it shows that security concerns surrounding presidential travel were ongoing. They were still using watch lists to identify potential threats. It reflects the heightened security environment after Kennedy's assassination and the proactive steps taken by intelligence and security agencies to monitor individuals they considered risky.
We don't know the specifics of this particular list, but its existence really underlines how much the assassination changed the approach to presidential security. It definitely highlights a stronger sense of caution and vigilance. Next, we have 104-10065-100028.pdf, and it details the recruitment and activities of Ramon Joseph Alvarez from the 50s and 60s. Specifically, his photographic surveillance of the Soviet embassy under code names like LIEMPTY. This seems like classic Cold War counterintelligence. What are your thoughts on how this might relate to the JFK assassination?
This document provides a detailed look into how the CIA was working against the Soviet Union during the peak of the Cold War. Ramon Joseph Alvarez's involvement in watching the Soviet embassy for so long shows how intensely focused they were on Soviet activities and personnel in the U.S. This document doesn't directly mention the JFK assassination. However, we have to remember that the Cold War and the tensions with the Soviet Union were a huge part of the political landscape back then. Some theories about the assassination have pointed to the Soviet Union or its allies. So understanding how the U.S. was operating against the Soviets during this period gives us context for looking at those theories, even if this specific document doesn't directly provide evidence.
It helps us visualize the Cold War backdrop against which the assassination took place. We also have 104 1065 100050.pdf and 104 1065 10069.pdf, which seem to be just blank transmission sheets. Do you think those offer any insights?
No, probably not. Blank transmission sheets are basically administrative records. They wouldn't have any information directly relevant to our deep dive into the JFK assassination. But the fact that they're included in these electrified files shows just how thorough record-keeping was within intelligence agencies.
That makes sense. Lastly, we have 104 1065 1075.pdf from 1978. It's a message from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or HSCA, laying out procedures for interviewing people overseas. It stresses the need to protect sources and non-official cover officers, or NOCs, and asks for the agency's cooperation. This one directly involves the ongoing investigation. What's the key takeaway here?
This one's important because it shows that official investigations into JFK's assassination were still happening years later. The HSCA was doing this in the late 70s, more than 15 years after the assassination. The fact that the committee was worried about protecting intelligence sources, including NOC's agents operating without official cover during these interviews overseas, highlights that classified information might have been involved. It also shows that the topic was still very sensitive. It really underscores that there were still questions, and people were still trying to find information long after the initial inquiries.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Our deep dive today has taken us through a variety of documents. While they don't directly reveal the culprit in the JFK assassination, they do give us a glimpse into the complex and active world of intelligence gathering during the Cold War and the Vietnam era. We see domestic surveillance programs like MHCHAOS, the monitoring of international peace movements, counterintelligence operations against the Soviet Union, and the HSCA's continued efforts to uncover more information years later.
Absolutely. While we might not find a smoking gun in any single one of these documents, together they paint a much richer picture of the world in which the assassination happened. They show us the kinds of individuals and groups that were under scrutiny, how far-reaching intelligence operations were, and the questions that lingered even years after the Warren Commission report.
And this brings up an interesting question for you to think about. How could these various intelligence activities and the concerns they reveal, even those that seem indirectly related to the assassination, have influenced our understanding of this crucial moment in history? What hidden connections might still be out there within this massive web of declassified records waiting to be discovered? It's a truly fascinating area to explore, and I hope our deep dive today has given you some insights and sparked your curiosity even more.
I hope so, too.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep digging.